Hey, my name is Gabby, welcome back to my channel, and today we're going to be doing some horror book recommendations. These are going to be some horror books that I think that you should be reading this fall, or honestly like any time of year. This is actually going to be my 6th installment of the horror book recommendations video series. So if you missed it, I've made 5 videos just like this one previously that have a ton of different horror book recommendations, so I will have all of those linked down below if you're looking for more. These horror book recommendations today, they have a wide range of different things. I mean, some of them are really short, like novellas, and some of them are over 500 pages. And then there's also some that are more on like the literary horror side, some that are more like weird horror. There really is something for everyone, so let's just jump right into it. So the first book that I wanted to recommend to you is one of my favorite horror books that I read last year, and that is Monstruo. Monstruo is definitely one of those like more literary horror books where it's more about the characters, and the horror in the book feels like real life horror, and that's what makes it so scary. Because in this story, you're following this family, and the young boy in their family, he's only like 5 years old, and he dies right at the beginning of this book. And the mother decides to keep her son's liver, and then she starts to grow that liver, and this liver starts to turn into essentially like a monster, like Monstruo. And this book is really freaking sad, but also very horrific. It kind of gave me the same feeling that I got when I read Pet Sematary by Stephen King, because I feel like those books have similar themes in the way that you're reading about a parent's desperation, and like how a parent will do anything to see their child alive and happy, and like that's really sad. But I thought this book was so good. This book had such a huge cast of queer characters, which I also really enjoyed. And I love that this book had so many different perspectives in this book, because you're not just reading from the perspective of the parents who lost their child, you also do get a few other perspectives in this book as well. I just thought it was so well done, and it's such a beautifully written horror book. I highly recommend everybody checking this one out. If you're gonna take one book recommendation from this video, let it be this one. Alright, the next one is gonna be a contender for like my favorite horror book of this year, and that is The Eyes Are the Best Part by Monica Kim. And once again, we have a book that, in my opinion, it does feel a little bit more on like the literary horror side. It is a bit more of a slow burn, it's a bit more of like a character study, but this one is very grotesque in my opinion, and there is a lot of body horror, especially related to eyeballs. So if like the whole idea of eyeballs really freaks you out, especially the idea of like eating an eyeball, then maybe steer clear of this one, because there is a lot of that, but this one is just so good. So in this story, we're following this young girl named Ji-won, and she is Korean American, and she's living in Los Angeles with her family, and their father has recently abandoned their family, and her mom is currently going through it because of that. And so every night at dinner, she keeps telling her 2 daughters to like eat the eyeballs of the fish, because she says the eyes are the best part and that the eyes will bring you luck. And so our main character, at first she's kind of like ew, like that's gross, like why would I do that? But then after a while she starts to really enjoy eating the eyeballs of the fish, and she starts to wonder about what it would be like to eat the eyeballs of a human, essentially. And in this story, because her mom has recently, you know, been abandoned by their father, she is very like lonely, almost to the point where she's like desperate to find something again. And so she starts dating this white man named George, who is like the biggest walking red flag of all time. And this book was just so interesting. In my opinion, it was so well written. I actually annotated this book when I read it, and I made like different colors with my highlighter for different things. One of the things that I made a highlight for was like the gross horror moments, because there was so much grotesque, disgusting body horror with the eyeball thing. Then I also had an annotation for any time there was like a red flag or an annoying man, which there was a lot of that in this book. And then I also had one for our protagonist becoming more and more unhinged. This is one of the best books I've read where like a character is like slowly like losing their sanity, becoming more and more unhinged, becoming more and more obsessive. It's just one of those books where like it really is a character study. It almost kind of reminds me of like the Joker or something in that way, you know? And it was just so good. Like I wouldn't say that there's anything about the ending of this book that is like unpredictable or like shocking, but it is so satisfying. Like there's something about the writing in this book that just really worked for me. I was absolutely disgusted by some of the scenes in this book. Like to this day, I will never forget the way that I felt reading some of these scenes. And I just also really connected with this character and like with her family. I feel like this author did such a good job of, you know, fleshing out these characters and making them all feel so real. Next book that I wanted to recommend is Diava by Jennifer Thorne, which is so crazy because this one was actually one of my BookTube book club picks earlier this year. So if you do end up reading this book, there is an entire live show that I have discussing this book with my friend Jan. But this one for me was such an unexpected surprise. Like I really ended up loving this book. I think some people might actually say the same about this book, that it's kind of more of like a slow burn. I loved that about this book. I thought the atmosphere in this book was so creepy and so well done. We're basically following this family who is on this vacation in Italy, and we're following the character Anna, who is kind of like the black sheep in her family. Like, they're the type of family that, like, anything that goes wrong, they just blame it on her, and she doesn't really get along with any of the members of her family. But while they're all on this trip together, they really do rely on her because she's the only one in her family who, like, speaks Italian and is, like, helping them get around everywhere. And they're staying at this villa in Italy where, like, all the locals are telling them that the villa that they're staying in is haunted by this woman. And so it is kind of a slow burn, you know, because while this family is staying at this villa, it's like this subtle creepiness, you know, because most of the story is about the drama between the family, but then, like, at night there's, like, creepy things happening. Like, there's, like, scratches against the wall, and, like, she thinks that she hears, like, young girls whispering, and she realizes, like, it's her nieces whispering in the night, but they're not even speaking English, they're speaking Italian. Like, I'm sorry, that is so creepy. Like, they don't even speak Italian. And there's so much, like, imagery in this book with, like, the little, like, gnats in Italy just, like, biting at their ankles and, like, you know, weird shit like that. There's, like, a lot of weird, unexplainable shit that's happening to this family, and I found the slow burn elements of this book to be very satisfying because I was just like, oh my god, what the heck is going on? This is so creepy. Atmosphere for me was a 10 out of 10 in this book. I loved it. It was my favorite thing about this. I think the second half of this book kind of takes a turn that's a little bit, like, unexpected, and I think that's why a lot of readers didn't end up liking the stories, because the second half of this book feels very different from the first half. But in my opinion, I don't know, I really liked what the author did with this story. I thought the second half for me was just as strong and interesting as the first half. And this is a book that I feel like I could talk about this book for hours. Like, I feel like I could dissect every little thing and try to figure out what the author was trying to say with that, which I really do love. Like, I feel like there is a bigger message that this author is trying to send with this book, which is something that I always look forward to in horror books. And so I would highly recommend checking this one out. I thought it was great. Another book troop pick that I had for the book club this year that I wanted to mention is The Reformatory by Tanana Reeve-Du, which this is another one that we read for the book troop this year. And this one is sitting at about 565 pages. So it's definitely the longest book that I've ever read for my own book club. And it's pretty cool that I ended up enjoying it as much as I did. I think I gave this one like 4.5 stars. This one is definitely a tough read. I'm not gonna lie. Like, this is a really tough book to read because of the themes in this book. And it also is historical fiction. This one does take place in the 1950s in Florida. In this story, you're following this young 12-year-old black boy who is getting sentenced to spending 6 months at this school called the Reformatory because he had an issue with one of the white boys in town, but he was like trying to defend his sister because they get treated so poorly in this town. But something about Robbie is the fact that he can see ghosts. And so that's kind of only the beginning of this story. And in this book, you not only get Robbie's perspective, you know, as he's going to this place called the Reformatory, but you also do get his sister's Gloria's perspective as well. This book has like 8 different parts, you know, like it is a long one. I'm not gonna lie, I think the first like 200-ish pages of this book were pretty slow, almost to the point where I was like, damn, like, am I gonna be able to get through this? Like, it was really slow, especially because historical fiction is not like my usual genre. Then, oh my gosh, the second half of this book, I just flew through that second half. I thought it was so strong. And this is definitely the kind of book that, you know, it really does pull on your heartstrings, almost to the point where it was like gonna make me emotional at the end, because by that point I was really connected to these characters by the end of this book, and it was just so well done. Next horror book that I need you to read sometime soon is gonna be Bury Your Gaze by Chuck Tingle. And yes, I actually went ahead and bought a physical copy of this book because of how much I loved it, because I actually ended up listening to this one on audio when I read it, which I do highly recommend the audiobook, by the way. I think the audiobook is so fantastic. It's full cast, there's like sound effects, and it was just a really, really cool experience listening to this on audio. But I did buy the physical copy because like I want this on my shelves. It's one of my favorite horror books that I've read this year. And in this story, we're following this character named Misha, who is a writer. He's like currently working on a bunch of different like TV shows and projects like that, and he's pretty well known in this industry. Like, he's had some pretty iconic characters that he's written in the past, and now he's working on this TV show where like the higher ups are telling him that they want him to kill off the gay characters, and he's kind of like, oh my god, like, this sucks. Like, why do we always have to do this? Like, why can't we have any queer representation where like they have a happily ever after, or like queer stories that are not just tragedies? And so he's kind of torn on whether or not that's something that he even wants to do. In this book, he also does have a best friend who is one of my favorite characters, and she's asexual and aromantic, which it was so freaking cool to see that representation in a book, because I never see that representation in books, especially in horror books. Plot-wise, I don't even want to tell you really anything more about what this book is about because it's kind of hard to explain, but also because I want you to go into this book knowing as little as possible, because this book is absolutely wild and so creepy and weird, and I went in knowing nothing, and I think that that was like the best experience that I could have had with this. But let me tell you that there are some scenes in this book that are so genuinely creepy that I got full body chills while I was at the gym reading this, like listening to this on audio. I was like, what the fuck am I listening to? Like, this is so creepy. There's one scene in particular that takes place on an airplane airplane, and like I will never forget that scene for as long as I live. I actually want to reread it so badly because I'm like, I remember this imagery, like, oh my god, it will stick in my head forever. There were just so many things that I loved about this. I mean, I loved the characters, I loved the different queer representation, I loved the creepiness and the eeriness, and it was genuinely like freaking me out, which I loved. The audiobook was fantastic, and it's so cool because the audiobook, all the narrators on the audiobook are all authors, which I also thought was so cool. So yeah, Bury Your Gaze is so deserving of the hype, and I think everybody needs to read this as soon as possible. It's definitely like a contender for my top favorite horror book of this year. And then also, while we're talking about this author, Chuck Tingle, I thought I would also recommend his other book, Camp Damascus. This is one that I actually read last year, and this is another horror book that also, you know, has a lot of queer characters and talks a lot about like queer representation, because in this story we're following these characters who are going to this place called Camp Damascus, and this place, you know, Camp Damascus, they are proud of the fact that they are the most effective gay conversion camp in the country. And so you're kind of following a bunch of different characters as they're going to this place called Camp Damascus, and you're reading about like the awful things that go on at this camp. And this book was just really interesting. I think I ended up giving this one 4 stars. I didn't love this one quite as much as Bury Your Gaze. Like, I would definitely recommend Bury Your Gaze over this one, but if you liked Bury Your Gaze and you're like, oh, I want to read more books by this author, and if you're just looking for more books in general that have really good queer representation, I would recommend this one for sure. The next books that I wanted to recommend are all books by David Sodergren. I mean, the first one that we have is The Horror, which is another contender for like my favorite horror book that I've read this year. I'm telling you, dude, this year in 2024, I've been reading some of the best horror that I've ever read. Like, it's been such a good year for horror. The Horror is definitely a contender for one of my favorite horror books that I've ever read. Like, I loved this so much. But then I also wanted to mention other books from this author as well. I've also read The Forgotten Island as well as Maggie's Grave. I think for me personally, The Horror is my favorite book that I've read from this author so far. And then The Forgotten Island is one that I gave 4 stars. I really, really love this. And then Maggie's Grave is one that I gave like 3.5 stars, I think. But they've all been truly some great stuff. Like, I would recommend all of these books. This one is especially special to me because I think that this story is one of those horror books that it's so much more than just horror. You know, like, there's so many more reasons why I love this story. And at the end of the day, I actually think that this is a really beautiful love story. Like, it is. It's a beautiful ass love story, and it makes me cry. Because in this story, we're following this elderly woman who's like in her 80s. She's living in this little village in Scotland called Witch Haven. And there's this huge company that's trying to like buy out this area where she's living because they're trying to like build a golf course on the land, and she is the most stubborn old lady. She's like, no, I'm not moving. I will die here. Like, I was born here and I will die here. And so there's a lot of tension happening in this town right now because of this that's going on. But then one night the fog rolls into the town, and what it brings with it is truly horrifying, as you can imagine from this cover. And that's all you really need to know going into this. The way that this book gets described on this description is also very interesting because it says this is a gore-soaked folk horror fairy tale. And I would definitely agree. Like, there's something about this that has like fairy tale vibes, but it feels very dark. And this book is also brutal, by the way. Like, the body horror and the violence and the gore, it is excessive. It is some of the most gory shit that I've ever read in my life. But like, God, I just love this, dude. I connected with the main character in this so much to the point where I literally almost cried at the end of this book. Like, it was so good. This author knocked it out of the park. Like, this is a masterpiece in my opinion. I loved this book. I also did love these 2 other books from this author for similar reasons, because like The Horror, I think both of these books are also very like bloody and violent and heavy on the gore. I did love the characters in these books, even though I connected with them a little bit less than the characters in The Horror. I mean, I think The Horror is just superior in like every single way, but both of these books were still really fun. And this one was interesting, The Forgotten Island, because it takes place on this island in Thailand, actually, which is really cool. And we're following these 2 sisters, which was really cool because I did really connect with the sisters. It's about how these girls get stranded on this island. It's just very eerie, very weird. It's kind of like survival story. I just really had a fun time with this. I thought it was great. And then there's also Maggie's Grave, which this one is also definitely very horrific. And I think I connected with the characters in this one a little bit less, which is the only reason why I ended up rating it a little bit lower. But this one also takes place in a small Scottish town. The story starts in like the 1800s, I want to say, where there was this character named Maggie who got pregnant outside of marriage, and everybody in the town was like calling her a witch. And they basically killed her and her baby in the most grotesque way, and they buried her at this little spot in the town. That's Maggies Grave. Now we're following these characters who are living in the same town in the year of 2019, and they're kind of like bringing this girl who's a tourist. They're like, do you want to go and see Maggie's grave and like hear about the local legend that happened in this town? And then shit really hits the fan. And this book was just so entertaining. It just really was. It was such a quick read. I feel like this author is so good at writing like fast-paced, gory, action-packed horror. You know, it's just fun to read the entire time. Like there's always something happening. There's no filler. There's no like slow pacing moments. He's just like high action, which I really like about his writing. And then speaking of high action, another book that I want to recommend is Fantastic Land, because this is another horror book that I read this year that I just absolutely love it. This one is another one where I kind of want to recommend the audiobook over the physical reading experience, because the audiobook is so good, because this entire story is told in like interview style format. And so because of that, the audiobook is so much fun to read because it's full cast. So like every chapter is told from the perspective of a different character. So in this story, there's this theme park called Fantastic Land in Florida that's kind of like comparable to Disney World. It's like a really big theme park. And there's a hurricane that comes through that is like absolutely devastating, and it leaves people stranded at this place, Fantastic Land, for like an extended period of time, and they can't get out of there. They're trapped in the theme park altogether. And it seems like all of the rules of society just kind of like fade away to the background, and people start to become very savage and unhinged and just like doing whatever they want and behaving very violently. And so this story is told in a very interesting way because we are learning about the events of what happened after the fact, and every single chapter is an interview with a different character who is like a survivor from Fantastic Land, and they're talking about what happened and like their experience while they were there. I loved this book. I thought it was so interesting. I thought that like the interview style of this book would get repetitive after a while, but I don't know, there was something about the writing of it. It just really worked for me. And I truly think that this book is like horrifying because of how realistic it feels to me. Like I know some people would say like, oh, that would never happen. Like there's no way that people would ever just start acting that violently so quickly. But it's also like, I don't know, dude, like the world is a dark place, and like some people are scary, and like I think one of the scariest things for me is like violence just for the sake of violence. Like there's no actual logical reason for it. That shit scares me. So if the idea of something like that really scares you too, then I would highly recommend this one. I thought it was so creepy and well done. Another horror book that I want to recommend is Bloom by Delilah S. Dawson. This one is on the shorter side. I would think this is almost more of like a novella because it's only about 200 pages, but this one's also got a sapphic romance kind of happening at the center of the story, which is also something that I really love about this. In this story, we're following this protagonist named Rosemary who meets this woman named Ash at a farmer's market. She's at the farmer's market, you know, just like selling her little cupcakes, and like she has all these little soaps and like different things like that. And they meet each other, and it's almost like this instant attraction. Like they just really enjoy each other's company. They want to be around each other, and they start developing a romance. And it slowly starts to turn into this kind of like obsessive, kind of like weird relationship between these two, and things quickly turn sinister and dark. I don't want to say anything more than that. I really enjoyed this one. I think I ended up giving this story 4 stars. Like there were definitely some things about these characters that really did annoy me, but then by the end of this book, oh my god, I was absolutely hooked. Like the last 100 pages of this book are just so unhinged and crazy, and it was so much fun to read this. I also feel like this author did such a great job in this book with like the descriptions of like the taste of the cupcakes that she was eating and the smell of the soap, and like I just remember the writing being so vivid. Like it felt like I could like taste the cupcakes and I could smell the soaps, and like it just really triggers like all of your senses while you're reading it, which is something that I really loved about this. One like literary kind of like weird slow burn horror book that I absolutely loved that I would recommend is Chlorine. This one is actually about this young girl who's a swimmer, and there's also a sapphic romance in this story as well, which I was really enjoying. But like the main horrific like weird thing that's happening in this book is that she believes that she's like turning into a mermaid. I don't even know really like how to talk about this book or how to describe this book because it is very strange. There was something about the writing of this that I just absolutely loved and immediately connected with. This one also is on the shorter side, if I'm remembering correctly. I think it's like about 250 pages or less. But this story was just so fascinating. It had an ending that I like had to reread like 2 different times just to make sure that I was understanding like what was happening. But I personally like I loved so much about this book, and I feel like this is one of those really good like feminist kind of horror books because it also talks about how like when a woman gets her period like once a month, like that is like an act of violence happening against our bodies every single month. And that's like not something that we really talk about. Like it's just something that women deal with. And like the way that it just talked about it was so interesting. Like I just loved the way that this author wrote this book. I just really connected with it, so I had to recommend Chlorine. I do think it's such a good horror book. Another horror book that has sapphic romance in it that I wanted to recommend is The Haunting of Velwood. This one was so interesting, and it's like so hard to try to explain like what this book is even about. Basically, there was this street called Velwood where these girls grew up together, and two of these girls that grew up on the street, there was 3 of them total, but 2 of the girls kind of had like a little bit of a will they won't they thing happening going between them, like they were into each other. Then something happened when they were teenagers and when they were leaving the town, where now the street that they grew up on is haunted. And the way that it's haunted is that like now nobody can access the street where they grew up on because there's some kind of weird, almost like bubble, like dome-like thing surrounding it, and they're the only ones who can get in and get out. It's kind of like Under the Dome by like Stephen King, or like some kind of WandaVision thing, like something like that, you know? And so now the story's taking place years and years later when they're adults and they haven't really been talking to each other much anymore, but they're trying to figure out once and for all like what's really going on with this street. And it is just, oh my god, it was so interesting. Like the whole idea of like the street being haunted was so unique and like incredible. Like I've never read anything quite like this. Like it felt so original and so different for like being a ghost story. I loved it. I also thought the sapphic relationship happening between these 2 girls, dude, like the tension between them, oh, it was so good. Like I would read an entire romance book just dedicated to these 2 characters because I was so into like whatever had happened between them. I was shipping it so hard. I think the only reason why I didn't end up rating this book like a 5 stars, I think I ended up giving this one 4 stars, and the only reason for that was because I thought it got to be a little bit repetitive in the end. Other than that, I highly recommend this one. I thought it was so good. One horror novella that I just recently read that just published that I have to recommend to you is The Night Guest. The book itself is about like 200 pages, I think, but the audiobook is only 3 hours long, and it's because the chapters are so short. Like honestly, some of the chapters are only like a sentence or 2 long. Like it is a very fast-paced book. And in this story, the thing that creeps me out so much is that in this story we're following this woman who is having some trouble with like sleeping. And it's not just like sometimes that she can't sleep, but then when she does sleep, sometimes she'll like wake up and she'll look on her like little watch and it'll say that she walked like 40,000 steps in her sleep and she doesn't remember any of it. And it's so creepy to me because one of the things that freaks me out personally the most in horror books is when something's happening to a character like while they're sleeping and like they can't figure that out, or like something weird is going on while they're sleeping. Like that is the creepiest thing for me personally. So I loved that about this. I thought this was so weird. There was one scene in particular that I will like, it stays on my mind because I'm like, that is so weird and that is so creepy. I will warn you though that there is some violence against cats in this book. Like there is some tough to read animal scenes at times, but other than that, oh my gosh, like I loved this. I thought it was so weird. The only reason why I gave this one 4 stars instead of 5 stars is because in my opinion, I think the ending just kind of like dropped the ball a little bit. I don't know, like I don't love the way that this one ended, but otherwise I think it's a very great and quick to read horror novella and I would highly recommend it. And then the last recommendation that I have for you is another horror novella, and that is Mapping the Interior by Stephen Graham Jones. I feel like in general, Stephen Graham Jones can be an author that is so hit or miss for me with his books, but where I personally think he really thrives is with his novellas, because this one is only 108 pages long, but it is so effective. This one definitely leans more on like the literary horror side. It's definitely a story that's more about family, and this one has so much heart because in this story we're following this young boy and his father has recently passed away, and one night he sees like a shadow of a figure in the living room who he thinks could be his father. It says when he follows it, he discovers his house is bigger and deeper than he knew. This book is also a lot about race, and it also talks a lot about like the Native American experience. I think the thing that stood out to me the most about this book was our main character's relationship with his brother. Oh my god, it was just so beautiful. Like it really stood out to me as one of those like really sweet sibling stories where it's about how like a brother's trying to take care of his younger brother. And, you know, as an older sibling, I just really connected with some of the, you know, things that he was thinking and like saying, and like the ways that he wanted to protect his younger brother from things that were outside of his control. Like, oh my god, it was just so beautiful that it almost brought me to tears. And that's definitely like my biggest takeaway from this book, is that I related and I connected so much to this main character. But I loved this. Like, if you're the kind of person who enjoys kind of like slow burn literary horror that involves more like family dynamics and stuff like that, I think you would love this. I think you would eat it up. All right, well, those are all of the horror book recommendations that I have for you today. I'm so excited that I finally got to do another installment of these horror book recommendations. As I mentioned, I've done a video video like this 5 times before, so I'll have all those previous videos linked down below. I will also have other videos that I've done linked down below. Like for example, last year I did a video that was like horror book recommendations for beginners. So if you're somebody that's kind of like new to the horror genre and you're looking for recommendations and you don't know where to start, I will have that video linked down below as well. Thank you so much for watching. You'll have to let me know if you've read any of the books that I mentioned in this video. Let me know what you think about them. And also, if there are any horror books that are not included on this list that you would like to recommend to me, then of course you can leave some recommendations down below. I would love, of course, anytime to have more horror recommendations coming from you, because that would be awesome. So thank you so much for watching as always, and I will see you very soon with another video. Bye!